How to do regime change right. You do it softly and you let the people change the regime. I am recording this on January 11th, and it is still an open question if the Iranian regime is going to fall or not. But I wanted to make this video now in the heat of the moment, in order to show how a good form of regime change isn't about invasion or installing a puppet government. Instead, it is about creating the political space for the people inside the country who already want the change to happen to make it so. It is about reducing the obstacles on the public for having their will be heard and felt. In essence, this means you are not pressing your will on the people, but rather that you are simply giving back power to the people to make their own choice. This means that often in international relations, the smart choice is also the morally correct choice. There are, in my mind, basically 5 conditions for a good regime change. First, you yourself, as the outside country, want the regime to change. Second, and most importantly, is that the people there want the regime to change. Third, which is also important, is that you think the people wanting the regime change are better than the people you want changed. Not every change is for the better. Fourth is that the regime has been staying in power through the use of oppression. And 5 is that you have the ability to curb that oppression. If these conditions aren't met, if the populace of that country hates you, and if changing a bad regime will give you a worse regime, or if the people do not want regime change and you would have to do it by force, then maybe you might want to explore other options, because doing it that way pretty much only leads to trouble. This is Causality. The news reports the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. My name is Shalom Bar-Eretz. I'm a major in the IDF reserves. I have degrees in political science, sociology, and international relations. And on this channel, we take a look at the reasons behind different events, not just what happened, but why they happen. But before I get into how to change a regime, let's first talk about the semantics of regime change and dive into what I even mean when I say regime change, when I say the word revolution, and so on. And while this might just be semantics, I think by looking at the different terms, how they are defined, and how they apply in the Iranian case, we can better understand the different options at play in Iran. Some of these options are unlikely, some of them are more likely. But through them, we can learn a lot about the situation. The smallest change that can happen in a state is a simple change in government. In the West, this basically happens all the time with every election. But in Iran's case, this would essentially mean a change in who is the supreme leader. Theoretically, this could be kind of effective in stemming the protests if the regime were to get rid of Khamenei and blame all of Iran's ills on him and replace him with someone more palatable and try to move forward from there. But I think in the Iranian case, this is a complete non-starter, as it is a theologically driven regime and the leader is supposed to be revered. Getting rid of him would kind of be a hard sell. The next step up in terms of changing government would be regime reform. This would mean that they would change the rules of the system in order to calm the protests, perhaps giving concessions in terms of democracy and freedoms. But this wouldn't mean any change which is fundamental to the regime, where there is a break in the continuity from the past. This might be tried by the regime if it feels it's losing control, though often the case has been in history that when an authoritarian regime tries to go down this route of loosening control, it actually kind of does the opposite and quickens their fall. But on an interesting note, if this were to succeed, it might actually be a pretty bad scenario for Israel and the West, because what it could lead to is a more competent and effective regime, which would be better at trying to pursue their goals of destroying Israel and the West. Now, when we move to full regime change, what we are talking about is a break in the continuity of the regime itself, the rules that it functions, the institutions which hold power. In Iran's case, this would mean that the entire structure of the supreme leader and its institutions would be replaced or removed. But crucially, the underlying ideology and the society would remain the same. Now, some of the options that would technically fit this definition aren't actually that great. One example, which has been proposed as possible, though I personally don't think it is that likely, would be a sort of IRGC military dictatorship. For some reason, this doesn't seem like such a great idea. The reason is that any form of regime change that I have mentioned up until now, which doesn't include revolution, you leave the ideological foundations of the state as is. A revolution, on the other hand, means that you are getting rid of the ideological foundations and you're having a society-wide reform and change. It means it is no longer an Islamic republic. I think revolution is what people are actually talking about when we talk about regime change in Iran. Anything short of that, and you're still dealing with a theocracy bent on Western destruction. It is only through revolution where you create a lane where people who want democracy, peace, and prosperity are able to get into power. The problem is that in Iran's case, the word revolution has been co-opted by the current regime, which proclaims itself to be what is, in my mind, that oddest of earnest oxymorons, an eternal revolution. I've never understood the appeal in the term eternal revolution. Why would a regime want to always be in a revolutionary state and never be the establishment? It doesn't scream stability or longevity. And yes, I understand the reasoning behind it. But perhaps the only real accomplishment they have had in this term is by making it kind of hard to express that you want a revolution against a revolution. It makes it awkward when you're fighting against an Iranian Revolutionary Guard to say that you want to do a revolution, and you have to make clear which revolution you're talking about. But as much as I like semantics, I really don't think it's ever kept people oppressed simply because it's awkward to discuss the word revolution. And I think this is one of the main reasons why people have simply used the word regime change. And going forward, I will as well. But understand that we are talking about revolution and not just regime change. Now, I'm personally very much in favor of the regime falling in Iran because, hey, who loves a large country who wants to have nukes and already has a large missile supply and who is on an unending quest to have you killed? So, on a personal level, best of luck to the Iranian people. May you succeed in your revolution, and may the result be a new era of cooperation between our peoples. But to our point. Let's say you want to affect change in another country. First, let's look at what you shouldn't do. To understand this, we need to look beyond simple international relations and look more towards human psychology. People fundamentally don't like being told what to do. And this is especially so if someone who's telling you what to do is from the outside, the other. And no matter how good intentioned, no matter how objectively correct the outsider might be, it doesn't sit right. Whenever someone from the outside is telling you how things should be done, there is always going to be a certain level of antagonism toward that person, especially if they are a peer or near-peer rival. What this means is that forcing a country to change its regime is always going to be counterproductive in some way, even if the vast majority of that country's populace agrees with you, even if they hate their own leader. If you are trying to force upon them a change in regime, you are going to have less support than if they did it themselves. Now, I think there is a time when you can intervene directly in favor of the people, and I think that the current situation, as of this recording, where the US has been threatening the regime that if they kill protesters, there will be an intervention, is one case where it could be acceptable. This is because it is happening in the context of an already occurring demonstration. And it is there to curb the regime's ability to oppress the will of the people, and not simply to force upon the people something from the outside. This is especially the case when there has been clear calls by individuals and leaders in Iran for US intervention. With that in mind, however, let us contrast that with the 12-day war that Israel and Iran fought not long ago, and see how it was different and how intervention then, with a clear push to change the regime, would have been counterproductive. What some proposed then and what Israel did not do was to make a strong push for regime change. Now, during that war, it was hoped by some that the streets would fill with protesters and the regime would fall overnight. Many thought that this should be the aim, but this didn't happen. Instead, the goal was self-defense, to get rid of the instruments of the Iranian state which were there trying to harm Israel. That being said, I think those events had a direct effect on the protests we are currently seeing. But I think the reason why this didn't happen then and it is happening now are clear. When your country is being attacked by a foreign nation, it might not be the best time to try and overthrow your government because it doesn't really matter how bad the government is or how much the government has lost support. There will always be some modicum of the rallying to the flag effect. Even if you have a core group of revolutionaries who want to destroy the regime no matter what, when you're looking for a successful revolution, you want to get the widest possible support you can. And this includes all the people who are either apolitical or on the fence or might be a little inclined for the regime. They might find it distasteful, even treasonous, to go out against the regime while bombs are falling. And as the old saying goes, there can always be the feeling that while they might be bastards, they are our bastards. Countries, like people, want agency. They want to make sure their leaders are there because of their own decision, that they control their own destiny. This is a fundamental core wish in human psychology. You want to make your own decisions as a person, as a family, as a tribe, as a nation. You don't want major decisions being made for you from someone outside that group, even if that's the correct decision. And this means that the most important part of regime change and revolution is that the people themselves want the regime change and revolution. And this doesn't mean that you're trying to pull a fast one over on them. It's actually to give them the agency. It's not about manipulating, it's about empowering. This doesn't mean that conflict can't be one of the impetuses for regime change, because hardships that a country goes through in a conflict can be the driver of people's discontent. You can see this from the economic difficulties in Iran, which were one of the main sparks for these protests. And while they weren't solely caused by sanctions, obviously they have been helped by them. The key, however, is that the goal of the sanctions and the communications of that goal were always that it wasn't for regime change, but to punish the regime full of ne'er-do-wells. What the 12-day war did and the physical strikes when Israel attacked was also to expose the lie that the regime made towards its citizenry, that the hardships that they were going through were necessary in order to defeat Israel and to be strong internationally. By destroying the image of strength that Iran had tried to build up over the decades, both through attacking Iran itself and also by destroying the proxies who were a sponge of Iranian wealth, it became clear that the wealth of Iran had been squandered through its military and foreign endeavors, and that it wasn't stronger because of that investment, but actually weaker. This means that the hardships undertaken by the Iranian people were for naught, whether you agree with the goal or not. I think this is crucial, because while you might be mad at the country who was bombing you when you couldn't put up much resistance, you are going to even be more mad at the government who wasn't able to put up resistance to that bombing, especially when that country is smaller than you. But of course, that air campaign had also a direct impact on the power of the Iranian regime. Israel bombed many military installations, especially those associated with the IRGC and the Basij. And while in dealing with an opaque structure like Iran, we can never be certain how much structural damage was really made to those organizations, I think it would be clear that the death of so many high-ranking officials throughout the Iranian military and political class could only weaken its ability to carry out oppression against its own people. And by weakening the instruments of that oppression, it allows the protesters to feel that change is possible, and also to increase their morale and their readiness to embark on a path toward that change, because it opens the door that this time, as opposed to the last, it could be successful. And by weakening the state on one hand and strengthening the protesters by giving them faith and morale, you can positively shift the power dynamics in the protesters' favor. So when they do go out into the streets, they can actually affect the change they want. What this means is you're not telling them to go out, but you are allowing them to be able to make their voice heard when they feel that the time is right, that they can actually make a difference. You're not telling them what to do. You are giving them the ability to do what they would want to do for themselves. Now, obviously, this only works if the supporters of the regime are in the minority, because the entire premise is that you are allowing the majority to make the change. Of course, the regime is quick to blame outside forces as the cause of the unrest precisely for the same psychological reasons I laid out here. It is even more important then that the protesters themselves know and feel that they are going out on their own volition and not at the behest of outside forces. And it must also be recognized that once change and resolution has started, the outcome becomes very unpredictable. There is no better example to this than the revolution that brought the Ayatollahs to power. It is always going to be hard to know who will come out on top. This might make some say that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, and that it can always get worse. But I think in this case, in Iran's case, there's a real question if there could be something worse. Because, simply put, it is a theologically driven, radical regime who has committed all of its resources to destroy Israel and the West. The only thing worse would be, as I said, a regime who was more competent in pursuing those goals. Now, I think it is still an open question of how to translate a successful revolution into the emergence of a democratic and modern state. It is one thing to destroy the old regime. It is another to shepherd into existence a new and capable one. There are so many moving parts, both in and outside Iran, that right now it is hard to see how this will shape up. And it is always best not to let our own hopes shade a clear reading of reality and the different possibilities. Among the variety of different forces and actors at play, there are a few I will briefly touch upon here. First, you have the exiled prince and son of the former Shah, who is currently making plays to shape the events in Iran, most visibly by communicating with protesters and directing them when and where to protest. I don't think it is knowable how much support he has in the country. We have seen many indications of pro-Shah statements and chants and graffiti, but how strong and widespread is this really? It is an open question. Now, it kind of makes a certain amount of sense to turn to the last pre-regime national symbol when trying to find something to unify different groups against the current regime, but I have no idea how this will evolve forward. And much of it depends on his own agenda. Does he want to be crowned Shah, or would he rather be the head of a transitional government? Will he eventually hand over power to a full democracy, or is he actually going to try to rule? Or would he rather be a monarch in the British model, with all the pomp but not the power? Another question are the different reports of ethnic and national groups preaching solidarity and resistance against the regime. Will this translate to separatist movements if and when the regime falls? Iran is home to many ethnic groups, but it also has a large history of integration and not so much of actual separatist movements, with some obvious exceptions such as Baluchistan recently. But the dynamics of revolution might kickstart more centrifugal separatist forces and galvanize support around hitherto fringe separatist movements. Of course, one of the biggest deciding factors in the future of the Iranian people are the Iranian people themselves. But because of the nature of the current Iranian regime, it is really hard to get a good read on the makeup and beliefs of the Iranian populace as a whole. And while I think that the assumption that the protests are largely democratic in nature can be true, it is important to ask how much of these viewpoints are truly widespread and how much is it just the West projecting its values on the protesters. I think that while the presence of pro-democratic and liberal feelings are truly there, I do not know, and I don't know if anyone does know, if it is 10, 30, or 80% of the total Iranian population's view. Another key actor, which hasn't really been heard yet, is the army. And while this isn't the place to get into the fascinating parallel structures between the IRGC and the Altesh, the regular national army, I think it is clear that though the IRGC is more firmly ideological and on the regime side, I wouldn't be so quick to paint the Artesh as if they are going to be easily swayed to the side of the protesters. Well, yes, there may have been some members of the Artesh speaking out publicly. I don't think it is really plausible that after 50 years of regime control, there isn't a good amount of loyal individuals in key positions in the Artesh. And finally, of course, there is the regime itself. And when I say regime, I don't mean only the Ayatollah and the politicians, but the bureaucracy and all the functions of the state, and all of their supporters. And while they might be a minority in Iran, for a country as large as Iran, the minority is millions of people. And they have, over the last half a century, amassed wealth, power, and yes, the weapons of the state. If they are to lose power, how they lose power is really important. Would they lose it piece by piece? And would this turn into a long civil war with areas of control? Or would it collapse suddenly, which could open the door for a quicker transition, smoother or otherwise? And this leads to a different question. Going forward, what place in Iranian society would those millions of former regime supporters have? What about the members of the regimes who were considered reformists? Do they have a place in the new Iran political structures? What about the bureaucrats? I think all of this is still an open question. What I have tried to do here is show that changing a regime is hard. It is hard to break the hold of a totalitarian regime on a state, but also trying to understand how that will develop might be even harder. And while it is easy to hope and wish for the best possible outcome, and I am guilty of this myself, I think we must always keep a wary eye when dealing with events that can turn out so differently. But again, it is hard to imagine an outcome for the West or Israel worse than simply the continuation of the current regime. I will hope they will choose the path of freedom, of democracy, and of an outstretched arm for peace. Again, this has been Causality. The news reports of symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. I'm currently making a push to expand my reach through X. The YouTube algorithm hasn't exactly been my greatest friend, but I have seen through comments that many have enjoyed the work I'm doing on this channel, think it's important, and wish for it to reach a broader audience. If you think this is something which is correct for you, give me a follow on X. I will be posting each time I upload a video, and by retweeting that post, we can perhaps spread this channel to new viewers. Thank you. Until next time, take care.